All right, welcome everybody to episode 6 of American Spirits, where we will be discussing the fifth book we have read for this show, Frederick Jackson Turner's The Frontier in American History, which is a collection of essays that he wrote over the course of his intellectual life and then compiled into this book, which was published in 1920. So it's just over 100 years old, and of course, we love old books here at the Old Glory Club. And yeah, so with the book introduced, thank you, Ryan, for joining me yet again as my co host here. How are you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm good. Getting towards the end of summer, August, my least favorite month because that's when the really big bugs are always outside and constantly annoying me. How about you, Mr. Prudentialist? We got a special guest here today, Mr. Prudentialist. Always great to have him on.
I'm very happy to be here. This is one of my favorite history books when it comes to American history, and I've talked about it before with fellow members of the Old Glory Club on our Substack, so I'm really excited to be here to talk about this one.
Excellent. Yeah. No, since you've read this before, a long time ago in college, that's great. And well, it sounded like you know a bit about Frederick Jackson Turner's biography a bit. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about who he is?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, the American mythos is oriented around the frontier to a point so much that we can't really escape Turner's frontier thesis when we look at the broader aspect of American foreign policy and American culture. American rightists, Southern conservatives, and even new left historians like William Appleman Williams will turn back to Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, as it's known, to sort of look at the history of American expansionism and our relationship to international orders. And in fact, I posted a screenshot on Twitter earlier today where Turner is looking at how, as the frontier closes, there's this more expansionist attitude towards American foreign policy, whether it's this push for the Panama Canal or it's the desire to move further into the Pacific. And these are the kinds of things that Williams would pick up on when criticizing sort of the history of America's foreign policy in the 20th century and sort of its sustainability in his eyes. But Frederick Jackson Turner comes from a long line of a politically connected, but also an academically connected family. His father was well known as Andrew Jackson Turner, and his mother was Mary Olivia Hanford Turner. And he was a Wisconsin Railroad Commissioner. He was the clerk of the Wisconsin Senate, as well as a well-connected political family within the Republican Party. So when we get into this book and these collections of essays, you'll notice that the what we call the Midwest today is called like the Old Northwest in relation to our expansion. But he was taught by quite a few academics at the time that were products of a European, specifically Germanic education. And as we'll see in this book and throughout the essays here, he is sort of he kind of holds to this germ theory. He got his from individuals like William Allen and Herbert Baxter Adams at John Hopkins, where he earned his doctorate. Those guys were also German educated. So he has this idea about, the deep forests of medieval Germany are the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons that would later become the Americans that would settle this land hundreds of years later. So you kind of see this Teutonic influence on his writings, but throughout the collection of these essays, we're going to encounter our relationship to England, our relationship to the Germanic peoples that immigrate here to the United States, as well as our conflicts with the Indian tribes throughout the entirety of the American frontier, starting in New England all the way moving out towards California and the Dakotas. So this is a really great collection of essays, and Frederick Jackson Turner, like him or hate him, or however you may think of his thesis, is seminal in our understanding of our own identity, as well as the frontier in the West as we know it.
Now, we should point out that Mr. Turner was not what you would call a monocausalist. He was even accused of this at the time. So, although he views the frontier as, let's say, the primary driving force behind American democracy, it's not like, let's say, guns, germs, and steel or something, where everything is boiled down to this sort of one theory. So we should make that clear from the beginning. We should also describe the frontier and how Turner writes about it in these essays, because when one thinks of the frontier or the West, most people might think of the Wild West, cowboys and Indians, and treasure hunting, and gold and trains and that sort of thing. And that is a later period of the West. But when Professor Turner, is talking about the frontier, he is writing about something that's existed in the Americas since the 17th century. When we were talking about the book Albion Seed on our first two streams, this topic is mentioned. There's discussion of the backcountry, and this backcountry that existed in all up and down the various colonies that we discussed, and that was the frontier at the time. So the frontier once existed in the state of Massachusetts, which is kind of weird to think about, but it's this ever-present and actually moving, migrating line that goes north to south, running all across the country, the furthest extent of settlement and colonization. And it's important that the listeners understand that this is what the frontier is in the context of this book. It is a moving place, and as the frontier moves west, the places that it was previously present in maintain a frontier pioneer characteristic to them, but with the addition of, particularly in the Middle West, what we now call the Midwest, they have an industrial development alongside, or replacing and integrating with, what was formerly pioneer settlements. Ryan, do you have anything you want to add as opening statements before we start getting into the meat of the book?
Just to specify, if I remember correctly from the opening essay, I believe the frontier was no more than 2 people per square mile, though I may be wrong about that. And that was by the Office of the Census. And then, in fact, the whole book, or the opening essay, I should say, since these were essays, opens with the Office of the Census declaring that the frontier no longer meaningfully exists. This is something that you should learn about in your U.S. history class. Even everyone in the mainstream today thinks this is still important. I remember whenever we went over it in my history class. So it's recognized ecumenically as a very important point in American history. But as we moved away from the sort of like a heritage understanding of America into a conceptual understanding of America, it sort of has lost its meaningfulness. If you view America as just an idea or an economic zone, then it really sucks that the frontier has sort of dissipated or gone extinct. But it's not a sort of existential meaningfulness that you might get if you understand that America has a long history, a set of generations that come from specific people that were shaped by this thing, which is why I think that we can do this book its due justice here on the stream after the last 5 weeks or so, because we have not necessarily traced. We haven't gone through like genealogies or through a straight line down through time explaining what the American nation is. But I think we've given our audience a great idea of who are the American people, what does it mean to be an American. So now that we talk about the frontier, we have the added meaning that maybe if you were in your U.S. history class, you might not have gotten. It was probably boiled down to just economic concerns, maybe geopolitical concerns, but nothing more. We have the people, is what I'm trying to say.
I agree. If we had not read the previous 4 books that we discussed on this stream, I would have gotten a lot less out of this. And that's a really important point, just in terms of talking about this stream. We highly recommend you watch the entire series, especially before it becomes quite lengthy, as we're going to be doing these every week for the foreseeable future. And we view this as a very important project in understanding this seminal question of what is an American. So hopefully the viewers will help us share the stream and get more eyes on this, especially while we're still in the early phases of this project. So there's one more thing I want to mention in broad strokes before I hand it back to Mr. Prudentialist to start getting into the meat of the book. And that is that, weirdly, from what I read in this book, what I came to understand in this book, that the frontier, the expansion of the frontier, was largely an individual phenomenon, and throughout all of American history, the powers that be be that England or the American government, actually tried to prevent the expansion of the frontier, and if not prevent it, highly control it. And this is to do with the typical understanding of power that there's a lot of assumptions built into what the audience has read on the material, but I assume you've been with us for a long time in this journey over the course of coming to understand elite theory and all that. The East Coast viewed the frontier as a sort of political threat in terms of especially an expanding democratic element that threatened their oligarchic or aristocratic power. So you, at least in my head, I kind of viewed the development of the frontier as this very top-down drive west. And it was actually quite the opposite in the way I came to understand the frontier expansion through Professor Turner. But of course, it was not possible to prevent the expansion of the frontier, and government controls themselves are what drove many people west. So I found that to be a really interesting clarification on the central forces behind why people were going west in the first place. Anyway, on to Mr. Prudentialist, sir. Do you how would you like to start out the discussion?
Well, just two things real quick. Ryan was absolutely right that the frontier was defined by a population density of no more than two persons or two individuals out per, I think it was a square mile or so. And that frontier line does change and evolve. And so our first essay is talking about the 1890 census. So this essay was written 30 years before this essay collection is published. So we do have this sort of long history of Turner constantly looking back on the frontier as this historical event, but also this evolving conceptual frontier line that keeps moving and changing. And then secondly, there's a whole chapter to talking about this aristocratic versus what we could call populist force, which is the West's contribution to American democracy, which talks a lot about the Jacksonian age, but also even earlier as well as after Jackson, that talks about how the frontier political society or who constituted a politician meant really the end of the trained statesman that we saw in the earlier colonial and post-revolutionary period. But I know that you had a series of screenshots, Mr. Charlemagne, that you kind of wanted to go through. What are the first? What's the first essay that you wanted to cover here? We have quite a few.
Well, let's see. The first screenshot I have is from page 31. If the producer wants to bring it up, and this is a quotation from a representative in Western Virginia. I won't read out the whole thing, but the point he's making in this quotation sort of highlights what I had described just a few minutes ago. The representative describes people who travel west and then return from pioneer life to enter politics. They become what he calls working politicians, and he highlights the difference between a talking and a working politician. So, quote here, the Old Dominion has long been celebrated for producing great orators, the ablest metaphysicians in policy, men that can split hairs in all abstruse questions of political economy. But at home or when they return from Congress, they have Negroes to fan them asleep. But a Pennsylvania, a New York or Ohio, or a Western Virginia statesman, though far inferior in logic, metaphysics, and rhetoric to an old Virginia statesman, has this advantage that when he returns home, he takes off his coat and takes hold of the plow. This gives him bone and muscle, sir, and preserves his Republican principles pure and uncontaminated. End quote. So you can see right there in the contemporary period when New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio were the frontier, how these people felt directly threatened by politicians of the West, who, of course, were, as he said, preserved in their Republican principles and were powerful men and not merely great orators or speakers. And of course, those who could combine that great oration skill, be that people like Lincoln, Davis, Calhoun, Jackson, with the that oratory power, with the spirit of the pioneer. These are some of the great statesmen of the time.
Absolutely. Also, go ahead, Ryan. Sorry.
I was just going to say very briefly, it's also worth mentioning something that we usually forget about is that in the stages of the early republic, there was a big push in academia, politics, education, and whatnot else to cultivate virtue in the population. That was the main push. Most modern educators don't know what to do with that because they deny the existence of such a thing. But this really does illustrate a great thing about the American frontier. This implicit idea by the representative from Western Virginia here, just implicitly stating that the frontier cultivates this virtue somehow. It's a very interesting admission, I find.
Yeah, Turner has this, and he's not just making this up. I mean, he's giving citation both with these speeches, but also about what the American frontier has done. I mean, in this is the screenshot is from the first essay, which is the significance of the frontier in American history, and so. The frontier was considered this great crucible, and I'm just going to give you this one quote here, where Dr. Turner writes, in the crucible of the frontier, the immigrants were Americanized, liberated, infused into a mixed race, neither English in neither nationality nor characteristic. The process had gone on from early days to our own. Burke and other writers in the middle of the 18th century believed Pennsylvania was threatened with the danger of being wholly foreign in language, manners, and perhaps even inclinations. The German and Scots-Irish elements in the frontier of the South were only less great. In the middle of the present century, the German element in Wisconsin was already so considerable that leading publicists looked to the creation of a German state out of the Commonwealth by concentrating their colonization. But the thing that Turner points out later on in this essay, as well as several others, is that it was either you made it or you didn't. And this fostered both an individual aspect because there was such a sparse amount of population or actual, what we would call maybe urban settlements or even just small towns where people could come together, and it forced you to really go on your own. And similar to other waves of European immigration into the United States, there is no handout. There is no dole on which you can rely on. So it was either you made it, you died, or you went back home because you realized this wasn't really worth it. And sort of the ethnic concerns over immigration have been present in America for the longest time. And this sort of concern, of course, is going to stay present with us even till today. But as Turner points out, especially in this essay, is that the concern about the frontier politician or the Western politician is happening in the backdrop of the debates over Henry Clay and the American system. And what do we do about giving land grants or more ordinances towards Western settlement, which of course outlines the sort of concerns that Charlemagne's screenshot here has, which is this concern about the balance of political power. So you have already, at this point in time in the early 19th century, already a three-way split of the country on ethnic grounds, economic systems, and then the overarching question that has been that had, of course, been the primary concern about balance of power in the United States government, which was about free and slave states.
Why don't we bring up screenshot 65, or page 65 rather? And I'm not going to read the whole thing. There's one clause in this screenshot that gets to something I want to mention at this point, and it says, finally, the towns were regarded by at least one prominent representative of the established order in the East. Now, we've talked before about the Puritan town system and the particular innovations in how they developed those layouts and expanded in a town by town basis, or at least they tried to do that. This is interesting because one of the things is, I think this is mentioned in the first chapter, but it's definitely mentioned early on, how the East Coast tried to control the expansion of the frontier through the way it issued land grants. And one of the contests that came up between the pioneers and the Eastern elites was that there would be these proprietors basically sponsoring the land's development with big East Coast money, whereas the pioneers were the people actually working the land. And you had this sort of contest between control and ownership, actually weirdly reminiscent of the problem of the managerial revolution as discussed by Burnham, right? This is this problem of outside forces trying to control something purely through being on paper the owners in contest with the people who are actually making the decisions on a daily basis. Obviously, if you're a pioneer, you don't want to. One of their main goals as pioneers were to escape these tendencies of the entrenched elites in any colony to control their actions. So that was a fairly early point of contention.
One that had been really there since our financial system becomes more independent and is more established after the Revolution and after even the ordinances of 1787. I mean, once the Homestead Act gets passed after the close of the Civil War, I mean, even then this becomes a great struggle to have Eastern, this sort of in what we could call it, I guess, carpetbagging to some extent, wherein people would come in and secure bank credit to now move out and install or put themselves to set up to buy massive plots of land out in the West. And a lot of television and a lot of American media doesn't really cover this anymore. The most recent example I can think of, and it's awful history in a lot of ways with its representation, but you have, of course, the AMC television show that ran for a while, which was Hell on Wheels, which talked about the expansion of the Transcontinental Railroad. But I mean, the frontier isn't there. And of course, this has in the backdrop of that show the infamous credit mobilier scandal, widespread corruption about government officials taking kickbacks and profits off Union Pacific while also allowing people to take government money and investment from people who had made money while trading in Congress, very similar to our problems today, to create land speculation and land rush for what would often be terrible territory or territory that would be turned into spots where the owner or the investor would make the most amount of money, in turn have that land be either worthless in 6 to 8 months or would be sold for pennies on the dollar after they had made their run for it. And that, of course, has to deal with George Francis Train, Thomas C. Durant. But I mean, these are things that have been part of the American efforts to stymie growth in that area, which is how do I enrich myself before someone finds the vast tracts of land before that. And even American politicians, when entertaining foreign dignitaries or representatives, even the president of, I think President Monroe in one of these essays points out where he shows this dignitary the vast amount of land out towards the west, and he says, look at all this wealth that I possess, even though it hasn't been touched yet.
Well, and there's something else to keep in mind as well, which is that we bring up the American system talking about this. It is not necessarily an economic doctrine as much as it is a scheme to tie the country together, especially by the Whigs. I think in the first essay really goes into this a bit more, but it talks about the showdown between Clay and Jackson over the issue of land. Henry Clay, the ardent supporter of the American system, the author of it, basically, trying to secure funding for it by selling off land out west for the common treasury, and then Jackson vetoing it, himself being a man from out west, and then saying that it should belong to the states, basically, so the states could decide what to do with it. Modern historians, of course, take that to be a state versus national showdown. But if you're really looking at it from this way, it's a showdown between sort of which part of the country is going to win out. The established East Coast, the part that was the frontier, but that's now established, the East Coast that is trying to sort of reenact the British policy from the middle of the 18th century, restricting settlement at the point of the Appalachians, or is it going to be the New West? And this is also something that was very important from the first essay, I believe that'd be the significance of the frontier, where the whole point about this frontier is that it sort of it de-civilizes the people that settle it. They're still European, Anglo, German, what have you, but it sort of de-civilized them, unlike the frontier in Europe, where people would flee into the forest to escape government. So this wasn't new. It's just the frontier had this effect on the people such that they de-civilized, re-civilized, and then became much more independent. So it's the fight between the established and sort of engineered aspect of the country that you can see in the American system, and then the culture in the West, which I think has ended up defining the country much more as time has gone on. I don't know if I can say either side won, but you see this fight for the soul of the country early on antebellum.
Anything you want to add there?
Well, I want to get to the second essay, unless you guys have anything on the first you'd still want to mention.
For me, the only thing I want to mention about, and I'm sure we'll cover it throughout the rest of these essays because it's not just a one and done deal. Of course, is the nature of America's relationship to the Indians. Turner points out that both French and English colonization would be able to take care of more or less this problem through trade. Turner writes very early on in the essay with regards to the Indians. Long before the pioneer farmer appeared on the scene, primitive Indian life had passed away. The farmers had met Indians armed with guns. We're talking about those that had traded with the French. The trading frontier, while steadily undermining Indian power by making the tribes ultimately dependent on the whites, yet through its sale of guns gave to the Indian increased power of resistance to the farming frontier. French colonization was dominated by its trading frontier, English colonization by its farming frontier. There was an antagonism between the frontiers, the two nations. Said Duquesne of the Iroquois, "Are you ignorant of the difference between the King of England and the King of France? Go see the forts that our king has established, and you will see that you can still hunt under their very walls. They have been placed for your advantage in the places you frequent. The English, on the contrary, are no sooner in possession of a place than the game is driven away. The forest falls before them as they advance, and the soil is laid bare so that you scarce can find the wherewithal to erect a shelter for the night." And I think that's sort of just an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about, like cowboys and Indians or the various conflicts. I know that you guys had talked about King Philip's War in a previous episode of American Spirits, and it's important to understand that, like, the frontier, even as early on when American colonization begins from the English, that our trade and our relationship with these individuals and these peoples becomes a period of clash where your economic interdependence either increases the likelihood of conflict, or in the case of the Indians, becomes very frequent wars for survival for either side, in part due to the ever-growing frontier line.
Now, the next segment I actually had was from the third essay, although it relates to Massachusetts Bay. Did you guys have anything specific from the second essay, the frontier of the Massachusetts Bay, you wanted to call out?
I focused less on that one personally.
Same. Well, that's fine. I'll read something from page 74. Or first, I'll describe what is here. So this is talking about New England, which of course relates to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Puritans. And as I referenced earlier, the Puritans had a unique way, as compared to the other colonies, of distributing land, where it wasn't initially given to individual proprietors or sold to individual proprietors, but the general court would actually establish committees to take a look at the land and see if it was actually suitable for the settlement of a town, because that is the only way that they initially sought to expand. And quoting from the book, quote, "This practice, seen in its purity in the 17th century especially, was markedly different from the practices of other colonies in the settlement of their backlands. For during most of the period, New England did not use her wild lands or public domain as a source of revenue by sale to individuals or to companies, with the reservation of quit rents, nor attract individual settlers by head rights or 50-acre grants after the Virginia type. Nor did the colonies of the New England group often make extensive grants to individuals on the ground of special services or because of influence with the government, or on the theory that the grantee would introduce settlers on his grant. They donated their lands to groups of men who became town proprietors for the purpose of establishing communities. These proprietors were supposed to hold the lands in trust to be assigned to inhabitants under restraints to ensure the persistence of Puritan ideals," end quote. And of course, that ties into the maintenance of the Puritan oligarchy. And of course, that did change over time. If we recall I think the previous stream we discussed, no, it was 2 streams ago, we discussed the economics to some extent of the Puritan colonies and the development of a sort of proto-capitalism within their society. And eventually they started granting lands to individual proprietors. Does anyone want to comment on anything I just read before I continue?
To expand on this from the Massachusetts Bay Colony essay, one of the things that a lot of the Puritan settlers had suggested was that We actually need to develop more, in part because we were operating under, of course, the system of indentured servitude. And in the early 18th century, in 1716, remarks were quite concerned that more townships and such needed to be built because indentured servants would arrive here and then they would flee because they would basically become runaways, thieves, and disorderly persons. So actually, we need to be investing more and building more in order to keep these people housed and to increase our settlements. And in relation to this, you see the factor of consolidation, both for defense, but also because the wilderness conditions meant that if you were managed to succeed, flee, and run away with a gang or something like that, that you could potentially be a threat to the existing colony.
Now,
The
as
only
the colonies... Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say the other thing to keep in mind as well is that if you remember back when we discussed Puritan society, it was primarily built upon this very strong sort of middle class, people owning small amounts of land, some owning more than others, but it still had to be this sort of landowning group of people that constituted Puritan society. It's the frontier that allows this fundamentally. So even though we typically, as Charlie said at the outset of this, we typically think of the frontier as this Wild West sort of thing, it has been absolutely fundamental to even colonial American society, going back to the very beginning of every good experiment by the English on these shores would have been impossible without it.
Yeah, the frontier is present in every phase of American history from the moment the initial settlers set foot on the continent. The frontier was right there, just a few miles off the coast. Whether we were governed by England or American governments, the frontier essentially had the same character and is really the one phenomena that connects all of American history together. Now, continuing with this description of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, quote, Governor Wentworth, who chiefly in the years, well, actually, before I read this quotation, let me explain the significance of what I'm about to read. So, eventually, the colonies in the New England area were all expanding, and there was competition to lay out the boundaries of your colony. So it was essential to start more aggressively making land grants in order to stake a claim before the New York or some other colony got there first. So again, quote, Governor Wentworth, who chiefly in the years about 1760 made grants of 130 towns west of the Connecticut in what is now the state of Vermont, but which was then in dispute between New Hampshire and New York. These grants, while in form like other town grants, were disposed of for cash, chiefly to speculators who hastened to sell their land rights to the throngs of land seekers who, after the peace, began to pour into the Green Mountain region. It is needless to point out how this would affect the movement of Western settlement in respect to individualistic speculation in public lands, how it would open a career to the land jobbers, as well as to the natural leaders in the competitive movement for acquiring the best lands, for laying out town sites and building up new communities under boom conditions. The migratory tendency of New Englanders was increased by this gradual change in its land policy. The attachment to a locality was diminished, the later years showing increased emphasis by New England upon individual success, greater respect for the self made man who, in the midst of opportunities, under competitive conditions, achieved superiority. The old dominance of town settlement, village moral police, and traditional class control gave way slowly. Settlement in communities and rooted Puritan habits and ideals had enduring influences in the regions settled by New Englanders, but it was in this Old West, in the years just before the Revolution, that individualism began to play an important role, along with the traditional habit of expanding in organized communities. So, the last bit of what I end quote. The last bit of what I read there actually, in some ways, calls back to the last two books we read. Sort of the slow eroding of the former Puritan ideals to be replaced with something else. Anyway, the next quotations I have are on the Germans. So we're now in the third essay, the Old West. Does anyone else have anything to add there?
Very, very quickly, I was just going to comment that and this is something that's present throughout all these essays, since you mentioned the erosion of the original Puritan founders and their ideals. The frontier has a materialistic element about it, but it's not in perhaps the base sense that our audience's minds might immediately jump to. You don't really have much luxury on the frontier to be overly abstract. That's just a very basic fact of the frontier. So the frontiersmen are not like atheistic Marxists. That's not what you should hear when you hear materialist. But they also do not have the ability to just establish Puritan society on the frontier. Puritan society requires that initial group of people where upon settling dispels the frontier. There's a fundamental contradiction here between wanting to have a sort of society like the Puritans that is specifically engineered to adhere to a very formalized and intricate belief system, and also wanting to settle the frontier in any real way. You can sort of extend Puritan society at a glacial pace, but if anyone settles the frontier, just naturally it will give rise to a more materialistic society. This is something to keep in mind, especially for those that have listened to the last few episodes.
The other thing I would add, just very briefly as well, on this point of society in this essay, of course, is the what Turner describes as the two New Englands. One is coastal, which is dominated by commercial industry and established congregational churches, and then well, I guess what you would call rural. What he describes as a primitive agricultural area, democratic in principle, with various sects of increasingly indifferent to the fear of innovation, which the dominant classes of the old communities felt. Already, speculative land companies had begun in New England, settlements in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, as well as in the lower Mississippi, and New England missions among the Indians, such as that at Stockbridge, were beginning the noteworthy religious educational expansion of the section to the west. And so already you kind of see what Turner will write about in a later essay about the West's contribution to democracy, or the Western characteristic of American democracy. Like, you've seen this already as early as in the Puritan age, the more developed, centralized congregational towns that had existed more or less from the beginning, to now, as we're rushing for land grants and the rest, we're beginning to see an emergence political divide here as well.
Now, one thing I wanted to mention from the third essay, The Old West, and I really just want to mention it because it's important, is the page 100 screenshot. I will just quote, "From its beginning, Pennsylvania was advertised as a home for dissenting sects seeking freedom in the wilderness, but it was not until the exodus of German redemptioners from about 1717 that the Palatinate and neighboring areas sent the great tide of Germans, which by the time of the Revolution made them nearly a third of the total population of Pennsylvania. It has been carefully estimated that in 1775, over 200,000 Germans lived in the 13 colonies, chiefly along the frontier zone of the Old West. Of these, 100,000 had their home in Pennsylvania, mainly in the Great Valley, in the region which is still so notably the abode of the Pennsylvania Dutch," end quote. So I wanted to read that in particular because the numbers simply highlight the expansive scale of German pioneering that was happening within the Americas before the Revolution. And this is worth pointing out simply because there can be a tendency among some people to overemphasize the degree to which America is specifically English. And of course, that is the primary element. But aside from other elements like the Irish and the Scots, you also have Europeans, particularly Germans. I don't know when this particular essay was written. I know the book was published in 1920, but I imagine this was probably written before the war. And of course, as we know, after the war, the German influence was very deliberately annihilated and scrubbed. So it's worth pointing out here that at the time, this was readily acknowledged, and the presence of the Germans in the Pennsylvania colony in particular is quite extensive. As he says, a third of the population.
Right. I hope that no one in our audience, anyone that listens to us, takes the idea that we've focused on New England for so many episodes to mean that the English are the only contribution to America, or the only peoples that can constitute America. We've particularly focused on them, if you didn't catch it from the last few episodes, because they've been so viciously maligned. But I have also noticed a sort of overcorrection, especially by our own people, against other Europeans, which were here just as long comparatively. They fit into the English mold, certainly. The English constitute sort of the backbone of the country. But it would be very wrong, and you would be excluding the American people, ironically, if you cut out everyone who was not English in heritage.
Precisely. Now, the next thing I want to get to, page 110 to 111 in the third essay as well. If there are any of these particular Roman numeral points toward the end of the essay you want to address, just let me know. I wanted to look at point 5 in particular, just because it once again emphasizes something I found interesting in the book. So I will just go ahead and read it. Quote, "The creation of this frontier society, of which so large a portion differed from that of the coast in language and religion as well as in economic life, social structure, and ideals, produced an antagonism between interior and coast, which worked itself out in interesting fashion. In general, this took these forms: contests between the property-holding class of the coast and the debtor class of the interior, where specie was lacking, and where paper money and a readjustment of the basis of taxation were demanded. Contests over defective or unjust local government in the administration of taxes, fees, lands, and the courts. Contests over apportionment in the legislature, whereby the coast was able to dominate even when its white population was in the minority. Contests to secure the complete separation of church and state, and later contests over slavery, internal improvements, and party politics in general. These contests are also intimately connected with the political philosophy of the Revolution and with the development of American democracy. In nearly every colony prior to the Revolution, struggles had been in progress between the party of privilege, chiefly the eastern men of property allied with the English authorities, and the democratic classes, strongest in the west of the cities." End quote. So I think this really gets to the core of the people who have made America great. And initially, the revolutionary men, the founding fathers, as we call them, were in that class of people. But later on, their spirit was maintained in the frontier for at least 100 years. You had men of the same type because of their mixing with the frontier and what that did to a man. It did the same thing to them as what the original founding fathers experienced in relation to England and England's domination over them. The frontier took to see the East Coast and its cities the same way that the Patriots saw the English. It was this, in some sense, foreign power, or at least a distant power, that was exacting all these various types of control over them, as were elaborated in that paragraph. And if you look again, some of the men who Jackson focuses on, he seems to particularly like Lincoln, Calhoun, Jefferson Davis, Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. Jefferson excluded, Jackson, Calhoun. These were frontier men, the people we seem to identify as most having the spirit of the founding fathers. They tend to come from the frontier in the 17th century. So anyone want to say anything in response to that?
No, I think that you nailed the head on, you hit the nail on the head on this one with regards to how Turner looks at American democracy. I don't want to say that Turner has a very specific idealism to the frontier, in part because if you have a copy of this text yourself, or even if you see down below on the screenshots, he is citing quite an exorbitant amount of sources here to sort of back up his claims, and also citing the men and women and clergymen, politicians, and the like to do so. And at the same time, to bounce off of what Ryan was saying earlier, you have these newcomers, and he points this out in the Old West. I think it's on page 92. I'll just read it real quick here. The conditions for, for instance, when he's talking about land grants and how many of these things get out here with lax requirements and even more lax enforcement for actual farming or cattle raising means that it was really easy to hold on to land. Legally speaking, you still had to hold it yourself. But Turner writes, quote, "These conditions rendered possible the extension of a measure of aristocratic planter life in the course of time to the Piedmont and the Valley lands of Virginia. It must be added, however, that some of the newcomers, both German and Scots-Irish, like the Van Meters, Stover, and Lewis, also showed an ability to act as promoters in locating settlers and securing grants to themselves." So already here, it's this push to keep moving outward and to find something that you're not going to find in these centralized urban or industrialized areas for the time, which is the ability to have land, title, and property for yourself, something that would come in Europe as well. This is a slight tangent, but if you were to read Jack Goldstone's, Revolution Rebellion from I think it's like 1600 to 1850, he talks about the increasing scarcity of land and titles of nobility, which help contribute to the French Revolution. And the thing that Ryan was pointing out about materialism earlier, like this is where you get to see like this is about access to resources and later what would become political leverage, so you can establish a town or a territory, or later on be counted for census makers for eventual statehood.
The other thing I was going to bring up before we moved on was just the two things building off of each other. This idea that the people out in the frontier viewed themselves as different from the people closer to the established coasts is aided by some of the things that we talked about last week, especially as the country grows older. The people in the cities, the universities, these very established and cultivated areas of the country by the coast are most likely to sort of artificially construct identities of themselves that are not inherited, like the people in the frontier would have no luxury of doing, or they would sort of invite in people that would not reach the frontier. The academics, they would go study under foreigners, things like this. They would import ideas. So the New England up until probably the end of the War of 1812, 1815, I think would be the Hartford Convention, had a very artificial Anglophilic identity compared to the rest of the country that did not extend out into the wilderness. And then, as we talked about yesterday, it was the Americans, the pagans out in the wilderness that resisted the importation of foreign ideas. So this is something to keep in mind, why this identity would start to develop. The frontier has a greater ability to just inherit the old things that were passed down to it. It doesn't artificially construct new things like the people near the coast, the cultivated, established coastline can do. And this is a kind of, it doesn't go that in depth about what I just said, but this is an idea in point 4 of the same thing. I don't think I need to read it out very much, but it's this idea that the frontier breeds nativism. And that could even be down to the most basic causes, that the people back at home start to worry that all the new people flooding in are going to dilute the country. That's one of the causes, but the other one is the thing that I just talked about. There's a proclivity of established society to construct an artificial identity. So that's something to keep in mind as well about this frontier. Something that makes it so different from the places out east, if you're in America, is that there's no luxury to cultivate these things.
Very good. And just one more thing from this chapter I want to highlight, just to drive the point home on page 114 to 115. I'll just quote briefly from page 115. The rest of the screenshot is a bit of text on Thomas Jefferson, who, interestingly, in some sense was maybe you would say a class traitor, in that he supported by far the frontier over the East Coast elites. But quoting one of those East Coast elites, Doddridge, quote, "The principle is that the owners of slave property must be possessed of all the powers of government, however small their numbers may be, to secure that property from the rapacity of an overgrown majority of white men. This principle admits of no relaxation, because the weaker the minority becomes, the greater will their needs for power be according to their own doctrines. End quote. So I think that just highlights the concern that the planting class, the plantation owners, had regarding their power, because the fear here was, as the screenshot has the text for, the fear was that the rural areas in the West were going to tax the slaves, the property of the aristocrats, in order to erode their power. And that, that quote right there really just shows you how desperately some of these men wish to cling to control. And you can really understand, I think, why the people in the rural areas would have the same views of these people that the founders would have had on the English elites. Anyway, I think it's about time to move on to the Middle West, which of course we call the Midwest, and perhaps discussion of the Mississippi River Valley as well. Mr. Prudentialist, would you like to take the lead on this part? As I think this possibly relates most to some of your areas of interest and expertise. Would you like to discuss the significance of the Ohio?
I certainly can. One of the things that this essay will dive into, the Middle West, and as what Charlemagne points out, this is kind of really what we would call the Midwest, of course. One of the first things that Turner really does highlight, of course, is the American relationship and these settler relationships of both under English and American governance, is, of course, our relationship to the French and the French colonies there, the French Huguenots, then what would later then, of course, be, the Dominion of Canada, and our relationship to the Indians. And of course, this is something that really Turner takes a lot of time looking at here, and to which, of course, we also have to keep in mind the size of the territory that we're talking about here. There's a very popular phrase that says, to Americans, 100 years seems like forever, but to Europeans, 100 miles seems like impossible to travel. And that is something that Turner kind of points out here when we come to talk about the wilderness and what gets called out for these land grants and what gets settled. Turner writes that the American people have occupied a spacious wilderness with its physiographic provinces, each with its own peculiarities, have lain across the path of this migration, and each has furnished a special environment for economic and social transformation. It is possible to underestimate the importance of state lines, but if we direct our gaze rather to the physiographic province rather than the state area, we shall be able to see some facts in a new light. It becomes clear that these physiographic provinces of America are in some respects comparable to the countries of Europe, and each of its own with history of occupation and development. General Francis A. Walker once remarked that the course of settlement has called upon our people to occupy territory as extensive as Switzerland, as England, as Italy, and latterly as France or Germany every 10 years. It is in this element of vastness and the achievements of American democracy that gives a peculiar interest to the conquest and the development of the Middle West. This effects of this conquest and development upon the present United States have been of the most fundamental importance. And that's on page 128 of the book, and then the essay about the Middle West. And when we talk about like the Midwest today, as much as we kind of look at it as sort of this political what we would call sort of this cautionary tale about maybe you can say globalization or deindustrialization and outsourcing to the world. Whether it's the Great Lakes and the Prairie Plains, which would later, of course, then expand on to the Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. You also have mainly, of course, some of the Ohio River Valley and Indiana and the Allegheny Plateau. This area becomes one of the most important trade routes and industrial sectors of the United States, and its settlement becomes fundamentally important for how we facilitate our relationship between England and, of course, the French traders in that area. In part because this allows the United States to have some of the most important arable land on the continent, but also, of course, we have some of the most extensive trade routes happening along the Ohio River and the Great Lakes. Something we don't discuss anymore, in part because we always focus on the Rust Belt. When it comes to the history of the United States, America's most extensive naval history, and I mean that in the maritime trade sense, not just like our naval capabilities as the Department of War, but we have a rich maritime history with the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley area more than we do in most parts of the country. And outside of our time trading internationally, we have more maritime history in this area because of how important these territories in the Midwest becomes. In part because this means that we're rich in limestone, and the glacial spread of the Laurentide Glacier means that there's a lot of ways in which we can replenish the soil more effectively. The Great Lakes themselves mean that we've got this helps the prairie plains surpass in fertility in regions areas greater than most parts of Europe, with the exception of the Black Sea. And so this becomes an area for really where we get to see the formation of sort of the regionalized American classes that we sort of associate even today in the 21st century. And it becomes really important in this essay where you're highlighting that the old Northwest, and what becomes later on the Midwest as we know it in this essay, tells us that like the federal colonial system that we had from the ordinances of 1787, they become the superstructure for how we develop out of this territory and how quickly it becomes for speculation, but also our territorial and state policy that would now later influence our move further westward, especially after the Louisiana Purchase, the acquisition of territory after the Mexican-American War, and later on in the 20th century with the acquisition of Pacific territories.
Yes, if you Google Ohio River Valley, you can bring up a nice image. It's like the first result of the area we're talking about, and it has some of the rivers highlighted. There's one sentence in this book. I actually found it one of the most important statements in the entire book on page 167, which reads, quote, "It was the Ohio Valley which forced the nation away from a narrow colonial attitude into its career as a nation among other nations with an adequate physical basis for future growth," end quote. And that basically summarizes the geographic aspects of the entire chapter and this entire region. The fact of the Ohio Valley, you must remember when the United States was first developing, it was not clear what the future of this continent would be and whether or not the states would be a sort of minor power on the East Coast or whether or not they would expand. And this Ohio Valley area, the Ohio River Valley, it wasn't clear whether or not the English would control it, the French, whether or not it would remain wild and Indian, or if Americans would actually conquer it. And when Americans did conquer it, the territory is simply invaluable in its natural resources and trading capacity with its access to the Great Lakes and the entire Ohio River system, which of course leads into the Mississippi. So this is really the essential point of this chapter, which is that when the Americans pioneered the Ohio River Valley, it is when the country was elevated in status to potentially being a major power, because this was not assured, right? There were still European powers, there were English powers on the continent that could have taken this land for themselves if they had had the will and the resources to do it, but the Americans took it instead, and this is what set the American nation on the path to its current greatness.
Ryan, do you have anything to add?
Not on this part. Just probably towards the end of this discussion is when I had points that I thought of when I was reading this.
The only thing I had really to add to is that the Midwest, or the Middle West chapter in this essay is also where the renewed political discussion over slavery begins to really take place here. And in part because what we would call the Midwest also illustrates that there's a lot of land here to be developed and exploited, and also for the question of commercial industry, but also slavery. Turner notes that Abraham Lincoln had migrated from Kentucky to Indiana and then to Illinois. Jefferson Davis moved from Kentucky to Louisiana and then to Mississippi in the same period. And we kind of get to see these earlier frontier lines being moved now for political purposes, but also because of this migration outwards further and further west from the older colonial territory that becomes the United States. We begin to see, of course, the question about slavery. And Turner points out that in the early history of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, a modified form of slavery existed under a system of indenture of the colored servant, and the efforts of Southern settlers in Indiana and Illinois to reintroduce slavery are indicative of the importance of the pro-slavery element in the Northwest, what we would call the Midwest. But the most significant early manifestation of the rival currents of migration with respect to slavery is seen in the contest that we know as the Missouri Compromise. The historical obstacle of the ordinance, as well as the natural conditions, gave an advantage to the anti-slavery settlers northwest of the Ohio. But when the Mississippi was crossed and the rival streams of settlement mingled in the area of the Louisiana Purchase, the struggle followed. It was an Illinois man with constituents in both currents of settlement who introduced the Missouri Compromise, which made the modus vivendi for the Middle West until the Compromise of 1850 gave to Senator Douglas of Illinois in 1854 an opportunity to reopen the issue by his Kansas-Nebraska bill. In his doctrine of squatter sovereignty, or the right for territories to determine the question of slavery within their bounds, Douglas utilized a favorite Western political ideal, which one of Cass of Michigan had promulgated before. Douglas set the love of the Middle West for local government against its preponderant antipathy to the spread of slavery. And again, this is a really important part here for the political history of the United States as well, because this is, of course, as the Whigs die out, we're looking for a new party. And then, of course, we have the look at the Free Soilers and what eventually becomes the Republicans and then the Democrats there. And I know, Ryan, you've talked about this part of history extensively, but this essay is particularly important as we see what the Midwest becomes, not only as this like very important trade, industrial, and agricultural sector, but also the very question that had been this tentative compromise for both the North and the South coming into play and coming very much to a kinetic opening here in the Midwest.
Right, and so this is I had two big points that I was thinking about when I was reading these chapters, sort of about the Midwest, the Ohio River Valley, and all this other stuff. But so the main thing, and this is something that I as I read about politics during this time period, it saddens me that modern politics, history, culture, and whatever else has boiled down the Civil War to just being a fight over slavery, because it turns out there's more than one cause to the Civil War, and there's definitely much more depth even to the slavery narrative. So if you look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this sort of popular sovereignty idea coming from Douglas, that if you want like a very proximate political cause for the tensions of the Civil War, this would be the one. Just because what happens is that you get people from the established areas out east coming west, to persistent theme throughout this book, bringing in new ideas. This is actually pretty interesting. If you look at the Republican Party that forms in the collapse of the Whig Party, you get two kinds of abolitionists. You get the sort of New England Unitarian minister, usually, that really hates the institution of slavery for religious reasons. And then you get the Free Soilers, which has a much more frontier-like ideology. And most of those Free Soilers would be closer to the frontier than the Unitarian ministers in New England. And once again, if you wanted to learn more about the Unitarians in New England, where they come from and whatnot else, we talked about that at length last week. So this struggle over slavery once again boils down to the frontier. We opened up parts of the frontier to decide this for themselves, this issue of slavery and its extension, and it came down to a fight between sort of an established Eastern political philosophy versus the people out west that wanted the frontier to remain open to settlers that were of small means. And this is also something that I wanted to discuss as well when we were talking about just the Midwest in general, or the Middle West, this large stretch of land of the frontier to about the Rockies, if you will, the Great Plains, the farmlands in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, and whatnot else. These people that would become populists towards the end of the 19th century. This is something that Turner points out. The populists, you can sort of see echoes of the frontiersmen from the era that we're discussing in these chapters. The populists were absolutely downtrodden by established business interests in the forms of creditors, railroads, and whatnot else that were very heavily funded by the capital in Washington. The frontiersmen wanted subsidization, basically, to live out in the frontier, or I should say the populace, the farmers, the agrarians wanted a subsidy to make farming out in the frontier more accessible, or at least more sustainable. And there were elements in this agrarian movement that were very xenophilic. This was the group of America during the late 20th century that advocated for large amounts of immigration, sort of diluting the country, if you will. That's how their opponents saw it. But there is still a nativist element to this, to the populists that came out of this frontier, because they were trying to keep this middle-class, small landowning section alive that had been here since the Puritans. So those were the 2 points I wanted to make, was that the frontier explains a good chunk of the crisis that would result in the Civil War, and it also has echoes in the sort of struggling middle-class, small means landowners that had been here since the first colonists arrived, that constitute, I think, the core of the country and the character.
Very good, yes. And I actually wanted to say something as well in relation to North and South in the Civil War. I don't know if we have the map of the Ohio River Valley available, but it would be good if we could bring that up. But in any case, as the book quotes, I have another quotation from page 139, but I'll just read that real quick. Just one part of it. It says, quote, "What gave slavery and state sovereignty their power as issues was the fact that they involved the question of dominance over common territory in an expanding nation. The place of the Middle West in the origin and settlement of the great slavery struggle is of the highest significance," end quote. And this also relates to the Mississippi River Valley, which we'll probably get into in a second. The South isn't just at this point the sort of Virginia Tidewater elite, right? It is a much larger region, especially after the Louisiana Purchase and the Mississippi River Valley becomes available. You have these Gulf states that are actually the majority of the land of the South, right? And these Gulf states on their own are developing economic power through their access to the Gulf and the use of the Mississippi River. And if it were not, the slavery question is ideological, but it's also related to these competing, effectively separate nations in a sense: the Southern nation, the New England nation, and whether the slavery question existed or not, it was a geopolitical contest between these two groups. And whether or not, the territories in the Ohio River Valley all became slave states, as we see, West Virginia used to be part of the Virginia colony. That could have been a slave state. So could have Kentucky very easily. So this was a serious power struggle between North and South. And the slavery issue couldn't really have resulted in a civil war were it not tied so intrinsically to these sort of great power games that were happening, especially when you bring the Mississippi River Valley into this, which is a even more potent sea power element than the Ohio River Valley was. It's also worth yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, just go ahead and finish your thought. I'll add right after.
I was gonna make a slightly different point. So.
Oh well, yeah. To both what you and Ryan were talking about is that it's really important to not reduce things down to univariate analysis or to just be monocausal, and Turner certainly isn't, especially when it comes to the question of the Civil War, because Turner does point out the geopolitical aspect of this as well, whether it's about the existing Union states wanting to, expand their own political influence in the area, but it's also about the Indian territory and the Indians that are there and their relationship to England or other countries that might have their own geopolitical axe to grind against the United States. And even with regards to the growth of like the Free Soilers, which, as Ryan points out, have a very nationalist tendency that comes from that Western sort of frontier, sense of populism that exists at this point in time. But also, just they have these tendencies that their struggle here is not just a national one, but it also has a sort of ethnic character as well. And Turner points out that Calhoun and Taney are shaping this issue now for the Midwest and really the Union. That any conflict that we're going to have is about preservation of the Union itself, but more is what Turner points out. It's also a war about the unoccupied West, where what happens to this land after, because we have the railroads, we have other foreign powers that still have an interest in this area, and then of course, for instance, the treaty with the Sioux in 1851, we get 20 million acres from the Sioux people, but also this allows a massive increase in population because people want to settle and take advantage of the land. And Turner points out that from 1850 to 1860, Minnesota increased her population by 2,730.7% in that decade alone. And so you're really beginning to see this change where American politics, just like today, the perennial problems of trying to make a democracy work comes down to territory, real estate, and demographics and voting interests based on those material needs, and of course for religious reasons as well. As it points out, Turner mentions that when it comes to the Midwest, what brings these territories closer and closer to the Union is the Germanic Protestant population, but as well as the Puritans that and their descendants that had moved out towards the Midwest. So we're really beginning to see, just like we do today, the ongoing issues of American democracy, which is balancing out material needs versus the ethno-religious character of those who are in those respective territories.
Yeah, that point is actually made deliberately on page 142 in the discussion of Kansas in particular, but I'll read from that. Quote, after Lincoln's election to the presidency, the Middle West, dominated by its combined Puritan and German population, ceased to compromise and turned the scale in favor of the North. The Middle West furnished more than 1/3 of the Union troops. The names of Grant and Sherman are sufficient testimony to her leadership in the field. The names of Lincoln and Chase show that the presidential, the financial, and the war powers were in the hands of the Middle West. End quote. So that really drives home the power of this region, the names of the people who came from it, the number of troops committed to the Union cause. And I think it'd be good to wrap up this chapter now before we go too long. I have a bit on the closure of the frontier in Ohio.
Just before we did, I was going to very briefly say, though, and this is mildly understated, the Copperheads in the North peace faction during the Civil War were also related to the frontier. You didn't typically find them as strong in established New York, New England. You tended to find them out west or in Kentucky by the river valleys, or in the frigid north in the frontier up there. So this is also something to keep in mind. Not only was the frontier areas the bastion of the North, if you will, and the lender of its greatest talent, it was also the faction of people that wanted to see the war ended anyways. It's a very interesting thing that the frontier attracts opposites quite frequently.
So we need to talk about the Mississippi River Valley, but first I will describe the future of the Ohio River Valley in the conclusion here on page 149. Quote, but these old ideals of American power, phrased in the new language of national power, did not meet with the assent of the East. Even in the Middle West, a change of deepest import had been in progress through these years of prairie settlement. The agricultural preponderance of the country has passed to the prairies, and manufacturing has developed in the areas once devoted to pioneer farming. In the decade prior to the Civil War, the area of greatest wheat production passed from Ohio and the states to the east into Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. After 1880, the center of wheat growing moved across the Mississippi, and in 1890, the new settlements produced half the crop of the United States. The corn area shows a similar migration. In 1840, the southern states produced half the crop, and the Middle West 1/5. By 1860, the situation was reversed, and in 1890, nearly one half of the corn of the Union came from beyond the Mississippi. Thus, the settlers of the Old Northwest and their crops have moved together across the Mississippi, and in the regions whence they migrated, varied agriculture and manufacture have sprung up. So we see how here he describes basically how the Midwest became a manufacturing center rather than the center of agriculture. And in this time period, which we'll get to a little later after we discuss the Mississippi River Valley, the frontier now takes on its prairie characteristics and moves out of the forests where the frontier had been throughout American history up until that point. And the prairie has very different characteristics to the forest. It's mentioned right there at the beginning of that, what I quoted, which is this idea of national power and the new needs of the pioneers, who are even further from the coast, from the East Coast, and the space is much wider and requires much more distances to be traveled in order to bring goods to market. But we will get to that. I think the next chapter is on the Mississippi River Valley, if I recall. Do you guys have anything to add on that before we move on?
Just on the Ohio Valley, Turner points out just its importance, and to a point where he calls it like the middle kingdom between the East and the West, and then the North and Greater New England, and then later on to the South of the Cotton Kingdom. So he really just calls it this place of great strategic economic importance. And he points out, too, that as American archaeology and our study of the Indians advances, as America becomes more of this national power in its own academy, that you begin to notice that the Ohio Valley, even prior to European colonization, is this area of great importance for those people. But he also points out that the Ohio Valley is settled by men of the upland South, which determines a large part of its influence on the nation as a whole. And that, broadly speaking, means really just chiefly Pennsylvania, which is, of course, Irish, English, Scots, Irish, and Germans, and other nationalities, really beginning from 1730 upwards till the Revolution, and even still to this day. You see the multiplicity of sects. You see the influence of German culture in the Midwest, and I just think it's important to keep these things in mind, that when we look at the history of the Ohio Valley and Ohio itself, while it often gets so memed upon today, it holds such an importance to the American character.
It makes all the anti-Ohio memes much more subversive in hindsight.
I agree.
It makes a lot more subversive in hindsight. Pretty much the whole North-South meme, the Southerner versus Yankee, the New Englander and the Midwesterner, these memes are actually all very subversive because they undermine really a lot of core parts of our history. There's this idea that like the real America was the South, and when New England went to war with the South, it went to war with America and like destroyed America. That's not really true, right? Like at all. Certainly a lot was lost in that war, and some very important parts of America were destroyed. But that is a very sectional and simplistic and wrong comprehension of what the Civil War was. Anyway, let's get to the Mississippi River Valley. I think we have a picture of it that can be brought up while I read a quote. This is from page 186 to 187, and I found this really interesting. It's a little long, but I will read it. Quote, "None of these nations deemed it impossible that the American settlers in the Mississippi Valley might be won to accept another flag than that of the United States. Gardaquis had the effrontery in 1787 to suggest to Madison that the Kentuckians would make good Spanish subjects. France enlisted the support of frontiersmen led by George Rogers Clark for her attempted conquest of Louisiana in 1793. England tried to win support among the Western settlers. Indeed, when we recall that George Rogers Clark accepted a commission as Major General from France in 1793, and again in 1798, that Wilkinson, afterwards Commander-in-Chief of the American Army, secretly asked Spanish citizenship and promised renunciation of his American allegiance, that Governor Sevier of Franklin, afterwards Senator from Tennessee and its first governor as a state, Robertson, the founder of Cumberland, and Blount, governor of the Southwest Territory and afterwards senator from Tennessee, were all willing to accept the rule of another nation sooner than see the navigation of the Mississippi yielded by the American government. We can easily believe that it lay within the realm of possibility that another allegiance might have accepted the frontiersmen themselves. We may well trust Rufus Putnam, whose federalism and devotion to his country had been proved and whose work in founding New England's settlement at Marietta is well known, whether he wrote in 1790 in answer to Fisher Ames's question whether the Mississippi Valley could be retained in the Union, quote, "Should Congress give up her claim to the navigation of the Mississippi or cede it to the Spaniards, I believe the people in the western quarter would separate themselves from the United States very soon. Such a measure, I have no doubt, would excite so much rage and dissatisfaction that the people would sooner put themselves under the despotic government of Spain than remain the indentured servants of Congress." He added that if Congress did not afford due protection also to these western settlers, they might turn to England or Spain, end quote. So I found that really interesting, this idea that the Mississippi River Valley area could become this separate empire, and it really all centers around navigation of the Mississippi and whether or not this would be permitted and safe and protected by whatever government they happen to be under. And this is, again, hammers home the point that the settlement of the West was not a predetermined outcome. There were other possibilities that could have led to more fragmented nations across the American continent should these issues had not been navigated successfully by the primarily Eastern elites. And of course, we see here now why the elites in the East had to accommodate the pioneers, because the Mississippi River Valley was absolutely essential in taking the United States to great power status and taking it out from under foreign influence, because the port of New Orleans controls everything coming out of the country. Jefferson points out that by trading through the eastern ports in New England especially, the United States was very much attached to the English economy. But to gain true independence from Europe, it was necessary to have the Mississippi River fully under the control of the United States. I'm sure Mr. Prudentialist might have some things to say in this regard.
Well, one of the things that Turner really points out here is that there's this huge different, I would say just a different political lens that both government and these settlers are looking towards, while the sort of individualistic character, I really do think it's important to maybe take a pause on that word, because we see so often individualism maybe be blamed for some of America's problems, or we have this very skirted, limited frame of reference for what individualism gets used for, whether it's cribbing off of perhaps what I would call pop libertarianism and not sort of the rooted libertarian understanding of individualism, which does really come from this frontier time frame, which is that where I'm looking to be a man open to making something for myself and to have the liberty to do so. For instance, one of the things that Turner points out with respects to state government and local provinces in the area versus these guys that want navigation, towards the end, he cites correspondence from the governor of Louisiana in 1794 and the men who really want navigation and want to cross into the Mississippi Valley. He writes the following, quote, if such men come to occupy the banks of the Mississippi and Missouri or secure their own navigation, doubtless nothing will prevent them from crossing and penetrating into our provinces on the other side, which being to a great extent unoccupied, can oppose no resistance. In my opinion, a general revolution in America threatens Spain unless remedy be applied properly. And the governor of Louisiana's chief concern, while pointing out, yeah, like it's easy to move about. They're trying to get their ability for papers, for all their speeches are about the free navigation of the Gulf and by the rivers. There's the greater concern that we're not in a position yet to take on Spain, and we're not in a position yet to understand that we're dealing with forces that we may not be able to fight on our own, especially as we're trying to get the nation settled and established. But at the same time, it's this push that Turner writes, and this is on page 185. The men of the Mississippi Valley compelled the men of the East to think in American terms instead of European. They dragged a reluctant nation onto a new course. And there's something very providential about that in regards to how important this valley is. And of course, not only are we talking all the way going back towards, approaching St. Lawrence, but all the way down to the Gulf of America and dealing with New Orleans and the rest, which I'm sure, the importance of New Orleans, both in the War of 1812, but even today economically, I'm sure that we cannot put a price tag on how important that's been to the history of just the American nation for access to international trade.
Yeah, I'll just quote Thomas Jefferson here, page 188. Quote, "There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans, through which the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market, and from its fertility will ere long yield more than half of our whole produce and contain more than half of our inhabitants. The day that France takes possession of New Orleans fixes the sentence which is to restrain her with her lower water mark. It seals the union of two nations who in conjunction can maintain exclusive possession of the ocean. From that moment we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation, holding the two continents of America in sequestration for the common purposes of the United and British and American nations." So that's just to highlight the point that Jefferson understood quite clearly how essential the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans was to whoever possessed it. And the French had the same view. I'll just quote from page 189. A French engineer reported to his government in 1796, quote, "All the positions on the left bank of the Mississippi, without the alliance of the western states, are far from covering Louisiana. When two nations possessed, one the coasts and the other the plains, the former must inevitably embark or submit. From thence I conclude that the western states of the North American Republic must unite themselves with Louisiana and form in the future one single compact nation, or else that colony, to whatever power it shall belong, will be conquered or devoured." And yeah, I have some other things here.
I think the other. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah. Very, very quickly, something else about the valley that is only briefly touched upon by Turner, but I think is a very not radical, but a very significant thing that he writes, is that it's also in this Mississippi Valley where we get American democracy as like a distinct system, and no one here is a big fan of democracy. At least I'd hope. But there's a distinction to be made here between the democracy that develops on the American frontier, especially in the valley, the Mississippi Valley, and the democracy that develops through abstract idealism like you would see in France. Turner does not take like a sort of Burkean conservative view of democracy and whatnot else. He rather takes a much more practicalist view that the American frontier's democracy really did not strive after an abstract ideal. It just used abstract language to describe itself, what was already happening, which was this sort of upwardly mobile middle class based around the land that you could find in the frontier, the farms and whatnot else, the cities that were emerging. This is something that, at least as a hobbyist in American history, I suppose, I found very interesting. It's another view of American democracy that you don't really have much adherence to today, this idea that it's extremely practical and only uses abstract language to describe itself. It's definitely a counterpoint to a lot of the American left in the modern day, if you can call them American, that view democracy as like an ultimate abstract ideal to which we must basically all become abstract to obtain.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part to consider what the American democratic system used to be at one point. Because as you had mentioned with that materialism earlier, it really does come down to the question of political power and how it can be limited, because you're looking at your own interests first. I mean, on page 191, I think there's sort of an important thing to consider. In the first debates about public lands, it was clearly stated that the social system of the nation was quite involved as much on the question of revenue. Eastern fears that cheap lands and abundance would depopulate the Atlantic states and check their industrial growth by a scarcity of labor supply were met by the answer of one of the representatives in 1796. I question if any man would hardly be enough to point out a class of citizens by name that ought to be servants of the community, yet unless is done with to what class of the people could you direct such a law? But if you passed such an act, limiting the area offered for sale in the Mississippi Valley, it would be tantamount to saying that there is some class which must remain here, and that by law be obliged to serve others for such wages as they give to please. And really, already you're seeing the question about labor, who's going to work, very similar questions that we get asked today, these sort of perennial questions. And this is too where Turner writes that out of this frontier democratic society, where freedom and the abundance of land in the great Mississippi Valley opened a refuge to all the oppressed regions, came that Jacksonian democracy which governed the nation after the downfall of John Quincy Adams. Its center rested in Tennessee, and the region from which so large a portion of the Mississippi Valley was settled by the descendants of men of the upland South. And he mentions quite a few names in this area, such as Jackson, Clay, Harrison, and Polk, as well as candidates like Hugh White, John Bell, Vice President R.M. Johnson, Grundy, and the rest. But I think it's also important that what Turner highlights about the American democratic system is that there is essentially a geographic center, and that center also plays an important part as the political center to balance out the frontier and the East. And one of the things that Turner points out later in his later essays, especially as the frontier closes, is that our democratic system functionally has no center anymore, geographically or politically speaking, because you have the industry of the East Coast and now the growing move of expansion towards the Pacific and the development of the Panama Canal that leaves America somewhat without a center to its own self politically. And we can kind of see that today as well, where now the country is very bifurcated in the sense that we have what often gets described as coastal elites, and what we see out of the paleo-conservative tradition in the 20th century, of what Sam Francis and Bob Whitaker and others would write about, which is the the middle American radical, the Mars revolution of the 70s and 80s in sort of paleo-conservative circles.
Yes, that is a very important point. This loss of the frontier greatly damages the American democracy, and the author makes some projections that I want to get to in terms of like how to replace that. But this was my view coming away from the book as well, that the loss of the frontier took away an essential characteristic of American society that's been with us since the beginning for hundreds of years, up until around the year 1890. I can't remember the exact year he cites when the frontier is declared closed. But it's interesting because you can in some way mark that closure as the point at which American society really started to degenerate from its ideals. It started to lose its high culture, and maybe began to pass from, what the Spenglerian terms are culture and civilization. It stopped being a living active culture when the frontier closed and became the civilization. Maybe. These are things I think we can talk about a little later as we get to some of his conclusions on. Let's see, we're 90 minutes in now. Is there anything else we want to say on the Mississippi Valley? There's certainly more things we could add, but
not particularly. No, I think that a lot of this essay actually really does focus on the demographics of who settles this land, as well as the political leadership that emerges, because this really does become the Jacksonian measure of just what we would call, I guess the first iteration of American populism. And that actually it leads into the next essay perfectly, which is called The Problem of the West, which really does speak about the relationship between frontiersmen Washington and state government.
Yeah, so let me read then from page 205, where he more or less describes what the West is. So, and this is the very first page of that essay. Quote, "The West at bottom is a form of society rather than an area. It is the term applied to the region whose social conditions result from the application of older institutions and ideas to the transforming influences of free land. By this application, a new environment is suddenly entered, freedom and opportunity is opened, the cake of custom is broken, and new activities, new lines of growth, new institutions, and new ideals are brought into existence. The wilderness disappears, the West proper passes on to a new frontier, and in the former area, a new society has emerged from its contact with the backwoods. Gradually, this society loses its primitive conditions and assimilates itself to the type of the older social conditions of the East, but it bears within it enduring and distinguishing survivals of its frontier experience. Decade after decade, West after West, this rebirth of American society has gone on, or has left its traces behind it, and has reacted on the East." End quote. So the West is really the constant renewal, the constant rebirth of American society, refreshing it with a new lifeblood as the frontier continues its development until the frontier is closed. And then we lose this ability to rebirth our society and develop these new frontier typographically both frontier but also old societies. Yeah. This is a really interesting chapter. It gets a little more philosophical. I'll hand it to either you or Ryan from here.
I was going. This immediately brings to mind. I think there was an exchange recently between Aaron McIntyre and Rufo, where Rufo was saying that the beauty of the American system is that you can just go to the frontier or to the wilderness or something. McIntyre responded, apt for the modern day, that the frontier is gone. So now what? This is something to keep in mind, is that if your country is built off of a finite resource that is rapidly decreasing, and then it closed, we lost that finite resource, at least in its original sense of the term, over 100 years ago. There's a big problem. So this, if we push the line that Americans are forged in the frontier, then no one living is an American. It has to be understood that American culture and the American heritage, the lineage, the people that you descend from, were the frontiersmen. This is something that I think is non-negotiable for the soul of the country. But, and this is also a interesting contradiction, I think, for some people on our side. You could keep the natural landscape open and free of people. You could have an artificial frontier where society just stops at some point. That's not going to bring the frontier back, and if anything, it prevents you from filling in the frontier as we did so often throughout our history. So there's a lot of challenge here, but I think this is something that has to be understood. The frontier is still relevant today for the people that are descended from the frontiersmen, the people who actually live out the way of life that they created. It is tempered by modern society. Modern society really does not like people on the frontier. They're too disconnected from the systems that we have, but it is still possible. And there's vulgar forms, there's higher forms of it, but that's something to consider, I suppose. It was an idea that I had when I was reading.
Yeah, one of the things that that lineage of descending from frontiersmen is also something that Turner writes about, especially in the old Northwest, or what we would call the Midwest now. which he even says the present states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So what we still call today the Midwest. He says, thus in the Old Northwest, a region where older frontier conditions survive in parts, where the inherited ways of looking at things are largely to be traced to its frontier days. At the same time, it is a region in many ways assimilated to the East. It understands both sections. It is not entirely content with the existing structure of economic society in the sections where wealth is accumulated, and corporate organizations are powerful, but neither does it seem to feel that its interests lie in supporting the program of the prairies in the South. In the 53rd Congress, it voted for an income tax, but it rejected free coinage. It is still affected by the ideal of the self-made man rather than by the ideal of industrial nationalism. It is more American, but less cosmopolitan than the seaboard. And he continues and he writes, we are now in a position to see clearly some of the factors involved in the Western problem. For 3 centuries, keep in mind, this book is published in 1920. Dr. Turner dies in 1932. But this essay is written a little earlier. Just right after, of course, the income tax is passed. With the settlement of the Pacific coast and the occupation of free lands, this movement has come to a check. That these energies of expansion will no longer operate would be a rash prediction, and the demands for a vigorous foreign policy, the interoceanic canal, as I've talked about, the revival for our power upon the seas, and the extension of American influence to outlying islands and adjoining countries are indications that the movement will continue. The stronghold of these demands lies west of the Allegheny Mountains. And this is where you see, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, some of the theses where writers like William Appleman Williams and even George Kennan, famously from the Midwest, from Wisconsin, both, while different in their political thought, are identifying a similar inherited trend and an inherited characteristic of the American culture, that we are a frontier culture and we're an expansionist culture. And when that frontier disappears, a new narrative has to be constructed. For William Appleman Williams, when he writes his famous book, Empire is a Way of Life, he builds off of what Turner writes here and says that expansionist idea is what gets you the open door policy and the beginnings of the American empire in the Pacific, and thus our involvement to be the dominant power in both world wars. For Kennan, he highlights that this has allowed the American system, as he understands it, to generate a powerful country and to look beyond its domestic capabilities and look abroad, both in commercial industry and, for Kennan, who would die in the early 21st century, the progress that comes with the space race and things like that. I mean, say what you will about Aldair McIntyre, but when he writes about this in After Virtue, that we are a people of narrative, the frontier becomes that because our traditions, our lived practices as a people comes from our frontiersmanship. And that's why even for hippies like Roddenberry, and as subversive as he was, like, what is space but a final frontier? Those narratives are still strong in the American culture, even though now they've been thoroughly either subverted or attempted to be eradicated, both with literal iconoclasm or recasting historical figures and such. A problem we see both in America as well as in our ancestral lands in Europe and in England.
Yes, Ryan said something earlier about there being no living Americans. In some sense, you could actually argue that if you take the frontier as an essential element of what it is to be an American, as Arian McIntyre pointed out on Tucker Carlson's show that aired today, what it means to be an American isn't simply a matter of race. The idea of the American nation is often confused with race, but it's an ethnic group, but it also means it's also something you be. And it seems like to really be an American, especially in a more spiritual sense, you have to have a frontier available for those types to pioneer, or else the society loses the absolutely essential characteristic that made it what it was in the first place. It's not. America's seems to be fairly unique in terms of its historical development, because it's the only culture in all of history that I could think of that had effectively just an open, effectively endless expanse of free land that was more or less uncontested. Obviously, it wasn't entirely uncontested, but for the most part, the Native Americans, or the Indians, I should say, presented little threat to the United States. And as we know, the European powers were really not up to preventing the United States from expanding. The Romans didn't have this, right? They had a frontier, but it was populated by incredibly hostile and powerful and competent tribes of Germans and Slavs, and even the successors of the Mongols. But the fact of this space's existence in America is also unique because it seems to be that in most civilizations, at least, the city is really the primary element of the culture bearing strata, especially if you think of something like ancient Rome, right? Rome, the city, is essential to the high culture of Rome. It's not the Iberian Peninsula or Gaul you really think about when you think of Rome and where its culture was really centered. But for America, the high culture was heavily, if not majorly, held by the pioneer type, and that's what prevented it from degrading along these crystallized lines that the author describes in the book on the East Coast. But now we don't have that frontier anymore, and we see that the culture is crystallizing and stagnant and feels dead. I think because part of what it is to be an American is simply gone now, and there are potential replacements for that frontier, but they're also being closed off to us on purpose by the ruling class. So this presents us with a very serious problem, but I think this presents us with the real key to what it means to have an American high culture, the frontier, something that no other civilization has ever had. China did not have it. Russia did not have it. None of the European civilizations had it. None of the civilizations in the Near and Far East had it. They're all surrounded by other powers, other hostile elements that could present a real threat. No one has ever had a high degree of civilization with so much free space available for. Anyway, I've gone on quite at length on that. Does this provoke any thoughts in either of you two gentlemen? Or am I just rambling?
No, I had something that I did think about, because if you took the groups that constituted America, especially during the early 20th century, late 19th century, Germans, English, Welsh, Scots, Irish, and everyone else, and you just put them anywhere else on the planet but without the frontier, it would not produce the same group over generations. It would be fundamentally different. So I think perhaps the best way to conceive of the frontier as it relates to Americans, and what it is to be an American, what it means to be an American, is just that it was formative for the people that we inherit from the people earlier on in our lineage. It's not just that they were a mix of German, British, some French, Scandinavian, and whatnot else, European races. It's also the fact that they were on the frontier. They had the high culture that you were talking about, and that did cause them to be fundamentally different, not in a base genetic meaning of the word, but the civilization and the people that have inherited it from them down the lineage are now different, and fundamentally so it's not something that can be recreated.
On this point, it's actually worthwhile to bring up something that needs to be reinforced and absolutely just hammered home for people, since we've referenced the Spenglerian concepts a couple of times in the stream. There's this misconception that America is Faustian, part of the Faustian civilization. It is absolutely not Faustian, and it is not Europe. America is its own civilization in the style that Spengler outlines, and it is not Faustian. Uh, the high culture of the United States, perhaps pioneering, would be the appropriate understanding of the essential element of the American civilization. This might be something for future historians to work out, but I can absolutely guarantee you they will not regard America as part of the Faustian civilization. And this is important because we're presented with the question now as to whether or not the American culture is the American high culture is going to fade or not. The Faustian one already has. Um, the first book we read was Albion's Seed. We are the seed of that Faustian civilization, but we are not it. And this really needs to be driven home if nothing else is from this book. This book is describing to you the American high culture in the type of terms that Spengler would use to in his models. Anyway, I'm going to assume both of you agree with that, but does anyone contend with that point?
I think it certainly is something that deserves its own episode or question, or perhaps an essay on the Old Glory Club Substack. Is this what is America today, and maybe the Spenglerian lens? And if we're not Faustian man, then perhaps what are we proposes an interesting question, and that's why we're here discussing these books, and that's why American Spirits exists, is to answer those questions. Because as you look at the frontier and what Turner writes, especially when it comes to, say, like the American democratic system, like, we've had great posts from the Old Glory Club social media guy in the past talking about how, like, you can kind of tell there is sort of this unique phenotype about American regionalism where you can kind of tell where someone is from based on just how you look at them. Like the Utah Mormons have a certain look in the same way that, like, the 250-pound linebacker from, like, Wisconsin, like, you kind of just know that he's from the Midwest just by looking at him. Like, there's a certain type based on the European lineages that have immigrated here or have, helped settle this. And when it comes, to the democratic system for America, is that you notice that those characteristics are still present, and it has shaped the country itself. And Turner writes, the last development of a Western democracy, at least when he's writing, is one that deals with its conquest over vast spaces of the New West. Each stage of Western development, the people had to grapple with larger areas, bigger combinations. The little colony of Massachusetts veterans that settled at Marietta received a land grant as large as the state of Rhode Island. The band of Connecticut pioneers that followed Moses Cleveland to the Connecticut Reserve occupied a region as large as the parent state. The area which the settlers of New England stock occupied, the prairies of northern Illinois, surpassed the combined area of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island together. Men who had become accustomed to narrow valleys in the little towns of the East found themselves out on the boundless spaces of the West, dealing with units of such magnitude as dwarfed their former experience. The Great Lakes, the prairies, the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Mississippi, and the Missouri furnished new standards of measurement for the achievement of this industrial democracy. Individualism began to give way to cooperation and governmental activity. Even in the earlier days of democratic conquest of the wilderness, demands had been made upon the government for support of its internal improvements, but this new West showed a growing tendency to call its assistance the powerful arm of the national authority. In the period since the Civil War, the vast public domain has been donated to the individual farmer, to the states for education, to railroads for the construction of transportation lines. And it is in this advent of democracy in the last 50 years upon the Great Plains, new physical conditions have presented themselves that have accelerated the social tendency of Western democracy. The pioneer farmer in the days of Lincoln could place his family on a flatboat, strike into the wilderness, cut out his own clearing, and with little to no capital go on to the achievement of industrial independence. But he notes that later on today that we now have to deal with expensive irrigation works, new companies, new laws, new the rest. And for us today, expensive irrigation works, new companies, new laws. And for us, out that the democratic system has been so thoroughly robbed of any of its American characteristics that Turner highlights, that just to what Ryan pointed out in that exchange between Chris Rufo and Orrin McIntyre, like that frontier is gone. And there are attempts that you could say to develop a new one. I think that frontier idealism is limited to people of certain means in foreign credit and international finance in places like Silicon Valley and the rest. And it leaves the question about the same thing that a representative had wrote that I quoted earlier. Like, well, you're basically mandating by law that there are people here that have to work for slave wages and the rest. And it's something that you and I, Charlemagne, have read about from, Fitzhugh and others, that there is certainly this concern now that we've reinvented a slave class that has now come at the expense of what it means to be an American.
You quoted something exactly I had selected as well, which is good because it advances us necessarily, as we're almost coming up with 2 hours now, and I figure we'd probably go for a little over that. So you've essentially summarized the development of the prairies west of the Mississippi and the changing characteristic of the pioneer away from individualism, because after the Civil War decided that we'd be one nation under God, indivisible, national power began to be projected as this came into being now as a whole that imposed itself upon the West at the request of the settlers, because the sheer distances involved and the arid nature. Anyone who's driven from Louisiana to Texas will comprehend how the climate changes there. The needs of the settlers meant that they needed the government to embark on these massive infrastructure projects and run the railway system and do all these other things necessary for them to settle. They could no longer simply go into the woods on an individual or small group basis and pioneer. So this latter phase of the West, of the frontier, the one we actually tend to associate with the West, the Wild West, cowboys and Indians and railroads and all this stuff. This is actually the point at which the frontier has begun to lose some of its original characteristics, and it will be expanded into very rapidly. Now, there are some more things we could look at, but I think we should probably, because we're really coming up on time here, kind of move forward to the conclusion where he talks about, in the last essay, the university. But before we do that, is there anything else in this last series of 4 or so essays that anyone wants to highlight before we get to the conclusion?
Ryan, anything from you before I
have nothing.
The one thing that I did have, and I think that this is something that still obviously exists today. This is on the essay about pioneer ideals.
Yes.
There's just one section here. It's on page 273. And this is, of course, as regards to the question of lumbermen and taxation, and then, of course, questions about the issue of what we would call just just monopolies and the rest. But one of the things on the previous page, of course, is that with regards to small town, something that we still have is this sort of rural. I mean, it still kind of exists in the mindset of conservatism in America, but like you talk about like extra legal combinations about how to enforce land rights and the rest, and of course this means lynch law and dealing with what we call frontier justice. But on 273, Turner writes, thus many of the pioneers, following the ideal of the right of the individual to rise, subordinated the rights of the nation and posterity to the desire that the country should be developed and that the individual should advance with as little interference as possible. Squatter doctrines and individualism have left deep traces upon American conceptions, but quite as deeply fixed in the pioneer's mind as the ideal of individualism was the ideal of democracy. He had a passionate hatred for aristocracy, monopoly, and special privilege. He believed in the simplicity and in the simplicity, economy, and in the rule of the people. It is true that he honored the successful man and that he strove in all ways to advance himself, but the West was so free and so vast that the barriers to individual achievement were so remote that the pioneer was hardly conscious that any danger to equality could come from his competition for natural resources. He thought of democracy as in some way the result of our political institutions, and he failed to see that it was primarily the result of the free land and the immense opportunities which surrounded him. Occasional statesmen voiced the idea that American democracy was based on abundance of unoccupied land, even in the first debates on this public domain. And even here, you kind of see this advance in sort of progressive republicanism of Teddy Roosevelt, who had famously had said that the American system of democracy has been like the greatest advantage in racial competition when it came to dealing with other civilizations, and particularly like just the concept of just the white European and American world versus the rest of it. And at the same time, even in today's absolute manic schizophrenic system of what you could even call democracy, which we're no fans of here. You even have progressives that are like, well, we have an abundance agenda. And that is, you can trace that K line straight back to our sort of frontier mentality of looking back about how do we find ourselves so resentful against sort of the rich or monopolies or what we would even call aristocracy. And, you know, say what you will, there are a lot of things to be said about what parts of what people might want to call from across the pond Americanism. But I think it's important that America is founded on this frontier and these pioneer ideals and the contradictions that come with it. And I think that that does echo what you had said earlier, Charlemagne, that we are, for better and for worse, but by God's providence, we are something unique into and of itself that future historians and our progeny will certainly have to reconcile with. I apologize for all the tangents I've made this evening. Just this is one of there's so many good things to talk about here.
No, your selection adequately fast forwarded through pretty much what I wanted to talk about with the Pioneer Ideals chapter. So that's very good. And now we're exactly at 2 hours. So I will you two, I'm sure you picked up on this as well. And this is a little more tangential probably than anything to the topic. But this is his forward-looking essay, I suppose. I'll just quote here from page 282. Quote, "This consideration gives importance to my final topic, the relation of the university to pioneer ideals and to the changing conditions of American democracy. President Pritchett of the Carnegie Foundation has recently declared that in no other form of popular activity does a nation or state so clearly reveal its ideals or the quality of its civilization as in its system of education, and he finds, especially for the state university, a conception of education from the standpoint of the whole people. If our American democracy were today called to give proof of its constructive ability, he says, the state university and the public school system which it crowns would be the strongest evidence of its fitness which it could offer. It may be at least conceded that an essential characteristic of the state university is its democracy in the largest sense. The provision in the Constitution of Indiana of 1816, so familiar to you all, for a general system of education ascending in regular graduations from township schools to a state university, wherein tuition shall be gratis and equally open to all, expresses the Middle Western conception born in the days of pioneer society and doubtless deeply influenced by Jeffersonian democracy." End quote. So the state university system, universities that anyone can apply to and enter into. What are your first thoughts on his take of the universities now being the center of American democracy with the disappearance of the frontier?
Maybe I'm not big-brained enough to have a ultra nuanced take, but I feel like he was wrong here.
Oh yeah, I mean that's what I want. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just a very simple thing. Okay, so I will give him credit here, especially during the Wilsonian years. It seemed like the universities had picked up this democratic spirit that he saw on the frontiers. Woodrow Wilson's whole historical school that he was a part of was trying to sort of analytically describe this and apply it to a sort of a historical science. So given that a historian was the president for 8 years until 1920 that basically agreed with the majority of what Turner is writing about here. Minor disagreements notwithstanding. Maybe he was very optimistic about it, but little did he know about the managerialism that would result from this project and completely destroy the ideals that he had spent all of these essays so beautifully describing.
Yes, well, I have a bit on that actually. Let me offer him even more of a defense. I mean, when the frontier closed, we kind of literally started building up, with the skyscrapers and cities, building up in a more metaphorical sense in terms of our advancement in scientific pursuits and I guess the bureaucratic elements needed to manage the society, if you want to give him that as well. I would focus more on this idea of building up within the cities themselves, though. But yeah, let me just move on to the next quote, page 284 to 285. Quote, in the transitional condition of American democracy, which I have tried to indicate, the mission of the university is most important. The times call for educated leaders. General experience and rule of thumb information are inadequate for the solution of the problems of a democracy which no longer owns the safety fund of an unlimited quantity of untouched resources. Scientific farming must increase the yield of the field. Scientific forestry must economize the woodlands. Blah, 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 end quote. I won't read the whole thing for time, but it's kind of interesting there because this whole thing of just general experience and rule of thumb, he almost just throws out the entire pioneer experience in favor of these new scientific advancements, which is quite a leap to make. Like, in some sense, he's like, okay, forget all of that. Actually, we are going to jump back to the East Coast elites, where Harvard is, by the way, and just run everything based on how they say we should. So that's kind of funny. But towards the end of this page, actually, he mentions, quote, it is no argument to show that it is not to the advantage of democracy to give over the training of the expert exclusively to privately endowed institutions. I mean, wow. Let me just keep going here. Page 285 to 286. Quote, by training in science, in law, politics, economics, and history, the universities may supply from the ranks of democracy administrators, legislators, judges, and experts for commissions who shall be disinterestedly and intelligently mediate between contending interests, end quote. I won't read everything else on screen. You get the idea. I find it interesting in that sentence I just read how he lumps in legislators and judges who are constitutionally the government with administrators and experts who are not constitutionally part of the government, but he just puts them all right there in that clause. And this idea of disinterestedly and intelligently mediating between contending interests, something throughout this entire book that Turner focuses on is this idea and problem sometimes of sectionalism. And in some sense, what I'm seeing when he says that, mediating between contending interests, I actually see him saying that we're basically going to eliminate politics with this expert class. And I think, if I recall correctly, Yarvin says that politics and democracy are synonyms. So in some sense, he's now just talking about eliminating democracy entirely. Finally, and then I'll pass it off to you, page 286 to 287, quote, a more serious danger will come when the universities are fully recognized as powerful factors in shaping the life of the state, not mere cloisters remote from its life, but an influential element in its life. Then it may easily happen that the smoke of the battlefield of political and social controversy will obscure the pure air that efforts will be made to stamp out the exceptional doctrine and the exceptional man, blah, 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 end quote. So, I don't know. What year do you think people finally caught on to the power of universities? Like 2017? We're talking like 100 years later. He's talking. He's fearful that the university will be recognized before this scientific man and expert can be trained up for the managerial class. And 100 years later, we're finally sort of figuring out on a mass scale the actual problem with doing this. So yeah, do you guys have any comments on that? I mean, I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but
And it's
I don't.
particularly interesting, in part because I'm using sort of this bifurcation of thought about the frontier from Kennan and Williams. But like, keep in mind, Kennan is based. I don't know if it's literally, but I mean, he's literally born in a barn, middle of nowhere, outside of not too far from Green Bay, Wisconsin. And, because of the state university system, he's allowed to take advantage of the newly reformed post 1926 reforms of the Foreign Service, takes the exam, ends up going to DC and to the East Coast, where he has no relations, no bonds, no nothing. And you sort of see the emergence of this sort of kind of expert or political man or just objective person trying to take hold of things. Although Kennan, by all means, is political, and that it's idealism at its finest. It is perhaps just the consequence of the age. I mean, keep in mind that this is in the 1920s. This is when we're really beginning to see the emergence of the state education system, John Dewey and the rest, that would sort of take hold. But at the same time, clearly he was wrong on this instance. There was no we're going to get rid of democracy as we know it. And if anything, democracy is then used by those very same institutions that he was once hopeful for to disempower and dispossess the American majority.
Yes, and in conclusion, I will read again what I found to be one of the most interesting paragraphs in the entire essay. On page 293, quote, "American democracy was born of no theorist's dream. It was not carried in the Susan Constant to Virginia, nor in the Mayflower to Plymouth. It came out of the American forest, and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. Not the Constitution, but free land and an abundance of natural resources open to a fit people made the democratic type of society in America for 3 centuries while it occupied its empire." End quote. And that's just a really interesting sentence because he calls out specifically that it's not the Constitution that gives America its character, but the free land and the abundance of natural resources and it being open to a fit people. And the question we have to ask now is, without the free land, still with the natural resources, but certainly without a fit people, can we once again have a high culture worthy of our own history? That's an open question for us to answer. So that's everything I had to discuss that we have time for on the book. I did throw up on my Substack a post of just my thoughts on the book that you can check out if you're a subscriber there, if you want to see all my screenshots and some of the ideas we discussed. Do either of you have anything to add in conclusion, starting with the Prudentialist?
I will say that I think the work that we do here at the OGC will help, I think, in the long run answer that kind of question of what do we do. I think because of our current structure and strata now being so thoroughly nakedly obvious that the democratic tendency of the frontiersmen, which we are descendants of, Americans. I mean that becomes the question: can that American frontier pioneer ideals that Turner writes about, which I think we all to some extent possess innately in ourselves, even if we may have differing political opinions or philosophies based on our education and experiences in life, we're all trying to come to terms with the fact that if there was a new frontier, it had been thoroughly shut out from us in the latter half of the 20th century, and any attempts to reopen the frontier either gets closed because of the hauntology of the Second World War or because of claims of racism or claims that would be politically incorrect or inexpedient to what is good and proper for the American people. And so in that, I think that what Turner writes here is a deeper history of the United States than most people tend to acknowledge. The frontier is not cowboys and Indians. The frontier goes to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It goes to Virginia. It goes to the 17th century and surviving King Philip's War and those of Albion seed that have held this land alongside with its German and Scots-Irish and other European immigrants that came here. and changed the national character as it became Americanized through the crucible of the frontier. And I think that when we read Turner and we read what he writes, both his optimism and his love for America and its history, that we should reclaim that love, and that we should have an understanding that America is a much older and richer place that, as I wrote 2.5 years ago, really does separate us from our European brethren, because American forests are vastly different than the European one. And the sooner we acknowledge that and appreciate what we have, contradictions and all, we'll be in a much better place politically, as well as sort of just America metaphysically about who we are.
Excellent. Ryan, do you have anything you want to say in conclusion?
I don't think that I have anything new to say. I would just re-emphasize that America is a distinct people. Any American has inherited this from the people before them, and but those people that they inherited the Americanness from were the people that were here and actually built the country. So it's not just it can't be reduced down to purely hereditary, and it can't be reduced to just actions and beliefs. This is something fundamental. The people we've inherited our identity from did do things actively and had beliefs that we have now had passed down to us. I think this is something to keep in mind as we go forward.
Since we mentioned Forrest just there at the end, I'll go ahead and do the Old Glory Club chapter, the Nathaniel Green Society, a plug. I was listening to a interesting podcast on the woods and some cryptid stuff on their channel. The podcast is called The Green Room, and it's episode 2 with Mellon and Porter, where they discuss this. So they're doing some pretty interesting podcasts of their own. I would definitely check out the Nathaniel Green Society's YouTube channel if you want more content from the Old Glory Club and its chapters. But yes, no, I think that was a really interesting book, actually. I'm really glad we read that one, and I think it was worth going a bit over to spend a little bit more time on it. So with that, Prudentialist, you got anything to plug?
Sure. As always, of course, be sure to subscribe to the Old Glory Club Substack. I will have an essay actually on this book out for our paid subscribers, which keep us going, and we're greatly appreciated for it. At the same time as for myself, I will have an essay out this Friday that is part 1 of 5. It'll be called Programmed to Post, sort of talking about the nature of algorithms and sociology, about how Twitter and other social media warps our brains, politically speaking. So I hope to do a lot of research on that one, and that's where you can find me. Just look for the frog on screen, and that's where I'll be.
Cool. And Ryan, anything outside American Spirits and Old Glory Club we should know about?
Just nothing new that I haven't advertised in the recent streams. Just go follow @TurnipMerchant on Twitter. But I have writings you can find at the Old Glory Club Substack, Mises.org, and I think those are the 2 most important places to find them.
Cool. And yeah, like I said, my Substack is charlemagne.substack.com. You can check out my post there on this book. And now that we're closing, I can finally go deal with these chipmunks I see outside, rooting through my stuff that have been annoying me. Oh, yes. 3 super chats. I almost forgot. Let me check the super chat list here. That was almost a big flight. Yeah, so I saw this one come in. We have one from Alexander Hale for $49.99. Thank you, gentlemen, for the work you're putting into this. I look forward to every new episode each week. We definitely really appreciate that super chat. That is quite a lot. It feels good to have our efforts here so appreciated. And then
Yes,
we got
thank you.
the white thumbs up from Machiavelli Sucks to Go for $4.99. And then Paul Fahrenheit sends us for $4.99. American high culture is cowboy high culture. It didn't die, but it was capped with how high it could go. Only way out is to reopen the frontier or go up. Yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it? How do we reopen some sort of frontier? But anyway, thank you, gentlemen, especially Mr. Alexander Hale for that generous donation. We really appreciate it. And next week we'll be doing Common Sense.